All right, so let's keep chugging along here with really like explaining why civilization and looking at some of these different theories that archaeologists have proposed. Well, after all of the techno-ecological approaches and traditional Marxist approaches, archaeologists started to become dissatisfied with them because there was this real recognition that they have a lot of limits and that they can't really explain the origins of civilization based off of what the archaeological evidence is telling us. And that's an issue, that's a problem. Um, and so more recently, there have been many different approaches that have been proposed. So with the origins of like post-processual archaeology, there has been a diversification of different approaches. There have been more recent modern Marxist approaches, more recent techno-ecological approaches, and even very like ideological and social understandings of why this may have happened. So in this very short lecture video, I just want to talk about what some of these are. Just like with a lot of other things in this class, I'm not asking you to be an expert. You don't have to know all of the nitty gritty details. I'm just looking for you to understand the major approaches to how this would be and the basics of each one. So one way that people have been doing it is they've been taking this very Marxian or Marxist approach to the past, and they've been saying, okay, rather than just focusing on the technology or the environment or agriculture, like we talked about in the last lecture video, instead they want to add a social element here. And so rather than just saying, well, some people were able to get on wealthy land and they got wealthy and then they hired other people and those people became the enslaved peoples, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, they're going to start talking about, well, how do these different classes of people interact with one another and how might that actually spark the emergence of civilization? So what they're doing here is they're rejecting any idea that we might call functionalism. And functionalism is this idea that everything in the past had to have a function. It had to say, okay, well, you know, this had to do this thing and this has to do this thing. It doesn't really allow for there just to be like very ritual or cosmological or idealistic parts of a society. And so what these new Marxist archaeologists are doing is they're rejecting the notion that people are just passive players, that people are just like, well, here's the environment the environment is telling me I have to become a civilization, so I guess I am today. But instead, that it's all about the ideas in people's heads, and that these aren't always entirely the result of external forces. So this slide, I apologize. Sometimes I type these up quickly. COVID, just like you're struggling, I'm struggling too. I admit it. That third bullet point there should say that they're not entirely the result of external forces, right? So if you look at everything we talked about in the last lecture video, everything was an explanation of what was coming from the outside. It was because you were building an irrigation agriculture because you couldn't control the weather. The weather was the outside thing. Or you have conscripted environmental things, so every population pressure. That's all coming from the outside. Here, we're going to start saying, well, what if it's just what people inside the society were doing? Maybe there didn't have to be an external force, but rather people were saying, you know what, there's rising social conflict, there are rising social inequalities in this community, and that's going to bring about radical social change. And so there may have been an effort by prehistoric working or underclasses to overthrow the government. And so the people in charge had to reinforce their power through the construction of monuments and through more strict bureaucratic, even hereditary power. So what the difference is, and all you really have to know is that these new Marxist approaches are saying we need to look at what the societies are doing within themselves and how it's these internal relations that might be spurring cultural change, not outside change. There doesn't necessarily have to be an external force here, but things can happen on the inside as well. Another contemporary approach that is emerging out of techno-ecological approaches and is really the modern processual look at this idea of the emergence of civilization is the theory of cultural evolution. And this is really drawing some comparisons with biological evolution, but it's a new, unique thing. So it's essentially talking about, okay, how can we talk about cultural evolution using some of the theories and the general ideas of biological evolution without making it actually about genes? So what instead some archaeologists started to do is they said, well, culture can actually act in a very similar way that genes do. And they call these cultural traits memes. And they say, just like genes get passed from one generation to the next, and that the more favorable and adaptive genes will get passed on, while the more maladaptive genes will die out. Memes and cultural traits are the same way. So essentially, certain social, cultural, or political forms must have conferred some kind of advantage or efficiency to individual cultures. So just like genes that are good get passed on, cultural traits, memes that are good will get passed on. And so essentially the new theory of cultural evolution says is that these elements of civilization, like sedentism and bureaucracy and social inequalities and hierarchies and state level religions and all the other things we talked about earlier in this module, all of those are conferring some kind of social advantage onto the communities who gave them. So these are going to continue to develop, right? And the thing is that in all of these different places, all at the same time in different parts of the world, we're going to see the same memes emerge, and those memes are going to get passed down one from generation to the next. And yes, the term meme, like in our internet sense, does derive from the same thing. Memes are spreading. That's why they're called memes. Right? So in this view, all an archaeologist has to do to explain why did civilization emerge is they have to come up with an explanation about how that was a positive contribution to the culture's efficiency or adaptive ability to survive, right? So for example, what we're gonna start seeing is in the Neolithic, we had all that beautiful decorated pottery. And I talked a lot about that in earlier modules. Once we get into like civilization, we're going to see that that individual beautiful decorated pottery is going to start to die out. Instead, where they're going to have people who are making mass-produced undecorated pottery. So the meme of decorated pottery dies out, and the new meme of mass-produced undecorated pottery is going to emerge and start to spread around. Why is this adaptive? Well, it's adaptive to the state level government because when you have undecorated pottery, it becomes a lot easier to say, we are all the same. And it becomes a lot easier to suppress individual group identity, individual creativity, things like that. It's very similar to what we see in a lot of other societies where we have dictator regimes, where they're trying to diminish the role of group identity and other things like that. So essentially, archaeologists would say this is a positive contribution to the civilization itself, so it's going to spread around, right? So that's what this new theory of cultural evolution is. It's trying to explain the emergence of civilization by looking for these means, looking for these adaptive things. This isn't a functionalist explanation. I said on the last slide that the Marxists were rejecting functionalism, but theories of cultural evolution, if you ascribe to this, you were talking about what function does each thing play in society and how does it actually benefit that society? So this is the theory of cultural evolution. And then finally, we have what we call holistic or synthetic approaches. And in a holistic perspective, what these archaeologists are doing is saying that one explanation, one theory, one theoretical approach can't really account for something as complex as the emergence of civilization. But instead, we're going to take all of these different approaches and we're going to create one kind of holistic, multifaceted approach in which we take every form of inquiry that seems to have some kind of contribution to our understanding of the emergence of civilization, and we're going to employ them all at the same time, right? Because each of these explanations that I've talked about before, according to the holistic perspective, will explain one single part of it, but not everything. Because we do have to explain how the environment comes into play. We do have to explain how technology comes into play. But we also have to explain how internal social factors and political factors come into play. We do have to sometimes think about, okay, well, how is that functional? Because sometimes people are rational and are going to do the things that are functional. But we also have to explain the times where people do things that are irrational and aren't functional. So we have to kind of combine these very functional explanations with cultural constructs that sometimes it's just the ideas in people's heads. It's just something that someone wanted to do, even if it's not really going to give them a good functional thing, that really allows for new social forms like civilization and new technologies like metallurgy to emerge. According to the holistic perspective, we also have to stop only thinking in terms of cultural similarities. So all of the explanations that I've come up with before are talking about how these cultures are similar. They're all doing agriculture. They're all in these fertile areas circumscribed by other areas. They all have violence. They all have these adaptive cultural traits. They're all about class conflict. Sometimes though, sometimes just focusing on similarities is going to mask a lot of the cultural differences. And so the holistic perspective says, when we have to make these explanations, we need to look at differences just as much as we do similarities. So a lot of new archaeologists are saying we can't just come up with one explanation, we have to come up with many different explanations at the same time. So I know that I didn't really answer the question, why civilization, in these two lectures videos, but the point is that in many ways, we don't really know. A lot of ways, we're still coming up with new data and coming up with new ideas. But I do want to emphasize that it's this holistic perspective that we need to be taking. Any theory or anything you see that says there's one single cause to anything, that's bullshit, right? But there's probably a lot of different causes and a lot of different things going into the emergence of civilization, right? So we have one more lecture video in which I want to talk a little bit more about, okay, how do archaeologists know when they see a civilization in the archaeological record? What are different archaeological evidence that they use to say, okay, this is now a civilization? And that's going to help us wrap up this